Good evening, everyone. Hi. Hello. We're going to go ahead and get started with the Fireside Reading Series. My name is Jolandra Larkins. I'm a program assistant with the Friends of St. Paul Library. The Fireside Reading Series is the Friends' longest running program, celebrating 31 seasons in partnership with the St. Paul Public Library. Thanks for joining us in our second season at Rondo Community Library. Fireside is made possible in part through appropriation from the Minnesota State Legislature to the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library as the Minnesota Center for the Book. Books for sale this evening are kindly provided by Black Garnet, located on University Avenue. We're so grateful for your support and your presence here this evening. We will begin with the reading and then open up questions to you, the audience. When we do this, please wait for someone with a camera link mic to get to you. It makes it a bit easier on the online audience and the speaker. Friends online, we have someone in the room to relay your questions as well. I'm happy to introduce you tonight to Naomi Cohn. Naomi Cohn is a writer and teaching artist whose work explores Reformation. Her past involves a childhood among Chicago academics, involvement in a guerrilla feminist art collective, and work as an encyclopedia copy editor, community organizer, grant writer, fundraising consultant, and therapist. A 2023 McKnight Artist Fellow in Writing, her previous publications include a chapbook, Between Nectar and Eternity, and pieces in many journals. Cohn has appeared on an NPR and been honored as Best of the Net Finalist in 2 Pushcart nominations. Please welcome Naomi Cohn.
Thanks, Jolandra. So
we will begin with a reading from Naomi.
Okay.
And then we'll open up questions to you, the audience, and then I'll ask questions to Naomi as well.
So we have I have a stack of readings for you, and actually we think we might split it up a little bit. I'll read a few pieces, and then we'll have a few questions, and then I'll dive into a few more readings, and then we'll let you all get a chance. Does that sound all right? So thank you so much for that introduction and for being here. The Friends and the library are just 2 of my favorite organizations, entities in the world in this incredible ecosystem of words and writers that we have in this town. Putting a book out in the world has just been amazing to realize how deep the networks are in our town. So, and I'm going to start, I passed out some Braille because while this book is about learning Braille and falling in love with Braille, none of the pieces I'm reading tonight have anything to do with that. So I thought, sorry. So I just thought, you know, a piece of Braille is worth 1,000 words. So that's for you to play with. And if you have questions, you know, probably they'll get answered. And can you hear me all right? Yes. All right. So I'm going to actually start with one of the things I love about the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library is they used to sponsor a thing called Known by Heart, where I convinced poets to present work from memory. And along the way, which was just their own work and other people's work, and it was just like, what do we care about enough to carry around in our hearts? And this is a poem that I carry around in my heart. And I don't claim to have any to have a totally parallel experience with Lucille Clifton, but I find that this poem resonates, especially the ending these days. It's, won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model, born in Babylon, both non-white and woman. I made it up here, standing on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other hand. Come, celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. Yeah, I love Lucille Clifton. So anyway, I don't know, just feeling it in the universe these days a little bit. So now from the Sublime to the Braille Encyclopedia, I'm going to start. One of the things that I like about readings is that I get to read out of order instead of having to go A to Z. So I'm starting with kindness. So a kind friend suggests, write about compelling strangers, that glint of connection illuminated in a moment, one stranger's hand gripping another's to step, mind the gap from a brightly painted boat to the salt-stiffened grasses of an abandoned island in the Venetian lagoon. A shaft of sunlight passes over a landscape, the beauty real, then gone. Compelling, but not in the sense of those invisible strangers who design algorithms that compel me to buy a used yak wool cardigan and a pair of paisley print rubber cowboy boots on ThreadUp. Or those unjust justices who stole women's authority over our own bodies. Lucky me, I don't have a uterus anymore, so I can't personally be compelled to bear young. Rather, I mean the compelling connection of strangers' kindness, how kindness intertwines with kinship. Like when I'm walking with my cane out to my studio a half-mile from my house in St. Paul, there's a guy sitting on the ledge in front of the old elementary school, the one that's now repurposed as a professional building. His bottle in its brown paper bag sits next to him. As I pass, he says, "Can I ask you a personal question?" Then, "Are you blind?" Then tells me about his old girlfriend, a flight attendant, who got glaucoma, and they fired her. Then he pulls up his trouser leg to show me his metal prosthetic shin and says, "Being blind, wow, that must suck. Can I give you $10? I don't take the money, but the kindness, by all means, I take the kindness." Thank you. So the wonderful folks at State Services for the Blind, I do, as you see, read mostly from super huge print, which has its own problems. And I thought, well, I'm getting worse and worse at that. So maybe I should just read my book about Braille in Braille. And it actually takes quite a while to get things into Braille, but they zipped out this copy of excerpts for me. And I was all excited. And I'm pretty bad at reading Braille. So anyway, you'll get a little slice of that. And I actually, I have been reading this piece a lot. It's sort of about how our society decides what blindness is. And given what's happening in a lot of people's lives, words like citizen and border I feel awkward about the metaphor I've used, but I'm still going to read it. So it's called Legal. A legal line cuts between vision and blindness. A person takes certain tests. The results become a passport, making one a citizen of one country or another. Read 8 small letters on a chart, and one is allowed to extend, for now, a stay in the country of sight. This makes as much sense to me as saying one side of a fish is in Texas and the other in Mexico, or shaving a clear-cut line across the 49th parallel, calling it the line between Canada and the US. Ravens, smoke from fires, slanting rain, all cross over borders without a thought. I was just in Chicago for a reading, and so I kind of pulled out some that have a little bit of a Chicago connection. Chicago's where I grew up, and this is from my before times when I still, with glasses, could read 8-point font. It's called Error. In the late 1980s, I worked as a copy editor, proofreader, and fact checker for Encyclopedia Britannica, my one brief corporate job. I earned my bread and butter by finding the widows and orphans, the third S nestled like a cancer cell in confession. The Chicago Manual of Style was our prayer book, a typo, a sin. To this day, I still cannot place a comma outside a closing quotation mark without a pinprick wince. I was the sort of person who turned off the grammar function in a word processing program because I was more highly trained than the software. This was a fact. What is a fact? These are troubling times for facts, but let me give a fact checker's answer. When I worked at Botanica, a fact was defined as something that could be verified in 3 reputable printed sources. This was back when a printed source was actually paper, just so you know. In the late 1980s, in Botanica's annual supplement, it was a fact that the writer Bruce Chatwin died of a rare fungal disease contracted on his extensive travels. I made this a fact that found its way into print because I found this information in 3 Britannica accepted sources. This fact was, in fact, a lie. Bruce Chatwin died of AIDS. It has been a shift of many years to become a typo-accepting person, to become, in fact, an engine of error. So should we have do you want to ask questions now or should we go on?
Yeah,
Yeah.
just, open up some questions.
Yeah.
One of the things that you mentioned, Naomi, that I love is when you talk about the things that we carry in our heart. For many cultures and tradition, language is one of the things that we carry in our heart. Language is the way many traditions keep their cultures intact. So I'm wondering, how has the language of blindness changed over time? So from, when you were a 15-year-old girl with the glasses, when you could still read 8-point font, how has the language of blindness changed, or has it changed for you?
Well, I think that is sort of, in a way, what the book is about, is growing up in a culture that has an enormous fear of blindness. I grew up steeped in that culture. So I remember when I was trained as a family therapist, I came across a study that claimed basically that people ranked going blind, that was a worse fear than a fear of dying. So granted, this was a psychology study, so take it with a grain of salt because most of them are not replicated. But I think it resonated with my own feelings about getting a bad diagnosis that might ultimately lead to blindness, but how people also responded to it. And so I think, we could spend all night on this question, but I think along the way, just learning that blindness is really a legal status. It really is a thing that's defined, because with my glasses off, I'm really not much more blind. But my retinal degeneration hasn't changed my sight much more than what I was like at 15 with my glasses off. But we could just put these on and then we'd all be okay, right? So but the huge piece of learning was just how, like, blindness is the whole world, is just how diverse a condition called blindness might be. And that when I was at Vision Loss Resources doing vocational rehab, people might all be there because they met the criteria for gaining assistance to adjust to blindness, but their visual experience of the world ranged from people who had incredibly clear vision in a small arena. I have what's called I'm a high partial by some folks' terms, because I still have a kind of full visual field and it's kind of fuzzy and broken up, but I still see a lot and I'm still very visually oriented because that's how I wired up as a kid. So there's probably folks in this audience too who could add to that. But yeah, just realizing it's a really diverse, non-binary thing, blindness. So, and that a lot of the difficulty is not in my body, it's whether I'm in a world that accepts that diversity or puts obstacles in my way. So.
And I love that we end on error because just as you mentioned, how, the terminology and the language around blindness was ultimately, back then was an error, So with that chapter on error, there's so much going on. There's facts based, you're speaking from your personal experience, and then you're also taking a fact more broadly.
Can we break that chapter down a little bit, and just kind of talk through your process in creating error? It's just such a complex piece, an entry.
Mhm. Yeah, I think there's just sort of capturing a memory of an experience that seemed relevant to what I was writing about. I think I'm hoping that that incident kind of captures that. I don't necessarily put my feelings all over the page in that piece,
Right.
but I think it's probably evident that that was a pretty horrifying mistake to me at the time. And now it's just like, yeah, we tried, we got it wrong. I feel like a lot of my life these days is modeling imperfection. So, you know, I do it well, right? So, yeah. So, but yeah, I hope that I think sometimes when I reach to talk about like larger political themes, it sometimes falls flat. I'm not good at that. It's important to me, but I also I want to just kind of put a little bit in there, right? It's not these aren't lectures, I hope. I hope they're not like encyclopedia entries where everything has to be provable.
Right. And then I'm also curious about the research that was put in Braille.
Mhm.
I mean, you're talking about different inventors. I mean, Louis Braille himself, you're talking about Snellen, you're talking about Tumbling E. How important and critical was research in creating this book? And what was that process like? Did you already have this information?
A lot of that came in pretty late in the process. So Rose Metal Press, who published the book, they were really more into, so they took the book back in 2020 and they're a very small, wonderful press, but they were like, we're going to be publishing this in 2024. So then when we actually got down to revisions, they were like, this is an encyclopedia. We'd like some information in it. I was like, what?
Yeah.
Oh, also, the book started as an essay, and then it kind of morphed into a collection of prose poems. I mostly think of myself as a poet. And then, during the pandemic, I had way too much time by myself, like writing and, thinking too much. And I was like, and I was moving more into writing prose. So I thought, why don't I use these prose things that I've been learning on this collection of prose poems? And they were game, which is a huge thing for an editor, for a publisher to be like, sure, just change the rules. Okay, great. But then they wanted me to be able to prove stuff. I was like, what?
Right.
Because as a poet, you just make stuff up and you're like, yeah, the speaker says this, it's true, and so all of a sudden I had this different standard to fit to. And so then, yeah, I went down a lot of rabbit holes. Like I had read about Louis Braille and I did find his life interesting and inspiring, but I, dug in a lot more. Yeah, sometimes the editor, that Snellen eye chart, the inventor of the standard eye chart that many of you might experience, one of the editors was like, found this article about that. So then I went down that rabbit hole. So sometimes they'd like, it's like put a little biscuit in front of you and I'm like, oh, I'll go find what that is. So, but I think of it as some of the facts are deep hardwired into the piece or, kind of grew up as the original plan. And some of it, I hope the facts are true. And I take research seriously. I used to do a lot of that for my work, both as a fact checker, but also working in nonprofits as a grant writer. Like you want to get stuff right. And you learn a few ways of finding stuff. But it's kind of more like, to me, it was more of kind of a shiny spray paint of like, here's some facts. This is an encyclopedia now.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
I want to take the time out to open it up to audience for questions.
Ooh, they're being difficult.
Yeah. Maybe later.
Oh, yeah.
I thought I'd save this question for later, but I'm just wondering, I have a friend who's losing her vision. Is it possible to get your book in an alternate format, like an audio book or?
Yes, you can get it through
Great.
Bookshare. It's Bookshare is an amazing thing. You can get books in either like an audio format, which is text to speech, so it's a computer synthesized voice. But also you can, if you're a Braille reader, you can get it in Braille. And State Services for the Blind is doing a human voice audio version, but I don't know the timing of that. Yay, right? Thank you, State. Yeah. So, yes.
Is that share through, is it an app?
It is, it's an organization, and yes, you can download an app. You have to sign up for it, but it's pretty easy, and it's just a huge array of all kinds of books, not just mine. So, thanks for that question.
We have taken another question from the chat. Do you think that the issues of blindness should be taught in schools for children to try to reduce the fear of blindness?
Huh. That might be above my pay grade, but I mean, I think that would be a huge, great thing if we weren't afraid of bodies that were different or functioned differently. I wonder like what my life would have been like if maybe I hadn't had to have glasses and I could just have wandered around and seen the world in the way I saw it. How cool would that have been? Yeah, I mean, I feel like there has been progress since I was 6 or 10 or 15-year-old. I find young people much kinder, and some of that must be because of teachers. But yeah, how you work that into curriculum, I don't know. And also, I don't know about, I do think children are, like if you put people in a situation where they experience each other as human beings, then that's great. But if I was put in a class and told blind people can be smart and do funny things and, you know, do all the things you do, then I'd be like, no. So I don't know, just, yeah, great question.
Should we open it up to more reading?
Yeah, I can do a little more reading. Maybe you guys will have a few more. So I'm going to continue on the theme of, so, you know, making mistakes isn't only something that happens at work. This one is called ointment. I don't even need to read it. Wow, you guys are really, okay. It's short, bear with me. Something a fly gets stuck in. Unguent, a healing salve, meant to be soothing, a balm. In the medicine cabinet, half-used tubes wait, their emptied ends coiled like scorpion tails. A tube of toothpaste and a tube of ointment feel so similar in the hand. These are great. Decimex and Colgate feel so different in the mouth. That one, unfortunately, is factual. Yeah. This one is called motivation. This is a slightly different, so we were talking before about how, before we started the official program, about sort of meaning, like encyclopedias are about curiosity, maybe they're about facts, but the definitions, that if we think about that more broadly, it's also about like what different things mean to us. And so part of adjustment to blindness for me was like what's important to me and what am I gonna spend time learning. So like was obviously really into words and reading. And there were other people like the 16-year-old kid really wants to drive. So they're really excited about the driverless car. So that's another part of what blindness means, is like what adaptation means is like, it's all based on what has meaning to us and what we're willing to get out of bed to learn to do. So this one's called motivation. If it's so hard, why bother? Why write, for example? Because I'm like that cliff-dwelling worm I'm sure I read about as a kid in that encyclopedia I loved. The International Wildlife Encyclopedia, an illustrated library of all the animals, birds, fish, insects, and reptiles of the world. 20 glorious volumes from aardvark to Zorro, a stumpy mutt-looking canine, for those that want to know. 20 volumes rich with fact and picture, with geographic distribution map, taxonomic information, and text in 3 important-looking columns. First published in 1970, the lead author, Maurice Burton, was once curator of sponges at the British Museum of Natural History. My parents bought me that set in the 1970s, feeding both my obsessions with books and with the animal world. I cooed over koala and kangaroo, flipped with a shudder past the slimy hagfish and the gruesome botfly. I kept those encyclopedia volumes for decades, the same way I kept the hundreds of pounds of other books I began buying for myself as soon as I had pocket money. Even today, I have books I bought the year my family lived in England. From 1975 to 76, when I turned 13, we lived in Sydenham, South London, not a very glamorous place at the time. My father, on sabbatical, spent his days tunneling in the records of the India Office Library, where he was researching the British colonial enterprise in South Asia. My mother was deep into a years-long hunt for the origins of the name Samantha. I spent my allowance on Smarties and caramels in white paper bags sold by the quarter pound at the sweet shop, on Osmoroid fountain pens from the stationers at the end of the high street, and on books from Kirkdale Bookshop, books from Watership Down and The Hunting of the Snark to Northanger Abbey and Persuasion. From more books on animals to I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. My mother complained of the cost, but my father shipped back a whole chunk of my English books when we went back to the States at the end of the year. I lugged many of those books and those that joined them from high school and college and into my 20s with me through much of my adult life, even when my altered sight began to make text unreachable. I lugged them from apartment to apartment in Chicago, from apartment to house in Minnesota. Eventually, I did my grieving and let the animal encyclopedias and most of the others go. But I still carried with me the memory of that coastal worm that I read about in the encyclopedia, how it lived by eating its way into a cliff face. Over the years, as it tunneled, it grew, boring a wider hole as it lived deeper into the cliff, eating mud and stone. I carried with me the story of how it could never turn around, the tunnel behind it too narrow for its present, larger self. The way a writer just has to keep tunneling, writing forward into the future. Thank you. So I've got, do you have time for two more, I think?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah, all
absolutely.
right. I'm gonna skip synesthesia. I'm gonna go straight to yearning. This one follows, my parents are ended up in revision kind of emerging as important people in this book, go figure. So I have a pair of pieces, actually there's a suite of pieces. One is called Marriage, which is about their marriage early on in the M's. And then I have two Y's, one called Yard Site, and it's about lighting a memorial candle for my mother. And this one is called Yearning. So the beginning of this piece will make a little more sense, maybe, with that context. Yearning. If my mother's been dead 15 years, that means my father's been dead 20. So we can never get back that last pastrami sandwich, the one my brother and I smuggled from Manny's Deli after my brother picked me up at O'Hare on one of our mutual visits back to Chicago. It was maybe 1999, 2000. We'd both moved away years before, but sometimes managed to time our visits to our ailing parents to also see each other. We can't ever feel again the exact heartburn after standing in the Manny's lunch crowd line, after shouting pastrami at the corned beef guy, making him turn his bulk and knives to carve from that peppery slab. After eating both halves and the pickle and the entirely excessive latke, watching the grease from that extra sandwich we ordered speak with a spreading mark on the white deli bag. We can get pastrami. There will be pepper, salt, and fat. Meat cured to the color of an heirloom rose. But we can't sit on a lakefront park bench with our father in the August heat as he ate that extra sandwich. The one we hid from our mother because she wouldn't have approved of all that cholesterol. We can't get back my father eating without dropping one cracked peppercorn, one single caraway seed, though his brain no longer told him where his feet were or his cousin's name. He still knew how to hold that sandwich with as much feeling as a blues harp player just before letting loose the most wailing riff. He still knew my brother, who clambered onto the riprap after a swim in Lake Michigan. My father offered his dripping wet child the leftover pickle, all that was left, glowing in the afternoon light. So we were talking about meaning. I realize a lot of these pieces are about food. So just so you know what is important to me. This one also, yeah, just saying, you know, how do I find the food on the plate? That's what I want to know. This one has been edited a little bit for those, so it's called, it's a little shorter than the version in the book. And it's called Yellow, and I'll finish up with this one. Yellow. Light with a wavelength of around 570 nanometers. Yellow pigments come from so many things you shouldn't eat, like cadmium and uranium, one form of which is called yellow cake. Genuine Naples yellow pigment was made of lead, chrome yellow, yellows from tin and rutile and benzodiazepines. Other than the honest dirt of a natural yellow ochre, all a pretty poisonous lot, those yellows. Even if you could find a brilliant yet edible yellow pigment, nothing could match the yellow of those eggs my spouse made me a few days after my abdominal surgery in 2021. Propped up in my tattered orange terry robe, I was grateful that my decayed vision spared me the details of the 5-inch incision, covered with its grin of steri-strips. Still wobbly from the useful poison of general anesthetic, I wanted none of my usual sriracha, kimchi, or salsa verde. I declined even black pepper, just wanted salt and scrambled eggs, a fluffy, buttery mass on dark pumpernickel. I'm not even embarrassed to repeat the animal grunts of delight over being alive, to eat that yellow cloud, to live with a man who knows how to scramble an egg, to still see enough of the visible yellowness of wavelength reflected back into my eyes. Yellow hallelujah, yellow butter in the pan, yellow sun clearing my neighbor's houses on a winter's morning. Sometimes I stare straight at it. What do I have to lose? Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Naomi. Those were just really great entries. Your writing is so witty and it's fact-based and it's poetry, it's poetic. I'm curious to know, what do you consider yourself? How do you feel about writing today? Are you a free-form writer or are you a poet? I know you said at heart you feel like you're a poet, but can you talk about your writing process a little bit more and just kind of speak to your experience with writing, Brielle?
So I try to make that, so I have been a poet mostly for 20 years. I mean, so I started my writing career as a grant writer. So I called that the other fiction, because, you know, you don't know what you write it, they're gonna, and actually when I first started writing, I wrote fiction. So I started in prose, but then as my eyesight changed, and at the time, we didn't have all the wonderful tools for ways of accessing information and story. So I thought, well, poems will be just a little easier to work with. And so I kind of shifted to poetry. It turned out to be a little 20-year thing. And I do kind of feel like that's, at my heart, I still really resonate with poetry. But then I was like, oh, I'm going to try writing an essay. And I was playing around with that. And so I go through this thing where I write something and I think it's an essay and people say, I loved your poem. And then if I write a poem, they call it an essay. Like, I feel like I'm kind of bad at both things. So it's like, I just write stuff. And then I try to figure out what it wants to be, like if there's anything in what I wrote that maybe is not just for me. And then I start to piece it together in different ways. So I once wrote a essay about my writing process where I called it a slime mold. So slime molds are this organism that sometimes they work as little individual single-celled organisms, and other times they kind of go on the march and they join together and they function as a multi-celled organism. So that's kind of how I write. I wish I was an organized person, but so then I just go like mush it together as a poem. It's like, no, that don't work. And then I go over to prose and just go back and forth. And eventually somebody says, stop, just be done. So
I think that's the beauty in Brielle, because we are going back and forth between poetry and prose. And it's funny that you mentioned you're not an organized person, because Brielle is alphabetical. And so I'm curious to know, what was your process and those entries? What made it and what didn't make it, and what ended up on the floor, like synesthesia? Just kind of talking about that process too. Were there editors that help you with the alphabetical order and piecing out those entries, and what was important, you know?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, or series of questions. So as I say in the book, I read a Rebecca Solnit essay, which was in an A to Z form. And I knew I wanted to write, when I started writing essays, I knew I wanted to write about the tools of blindness. So I've written a piece about my cane. I knew I wanted to write about braille. I didn't know, the braille one just kind of got out of hand. I don't know what else to say about it. I just was really into it, and there was more and more to say, and it got messier and messier. And so I just thought, wow, A to Z, that'll just be a way to kind of like organize this material. And also because one of the cool or weird things about learning, I started learning Braille when I was 47, and like I could just make out what an A was versus a B was. It took me like 5 years to get to like, I don't know, not even second grade. But so it just really, as a writer, it really slowed me down. And that was actually kind of cool, like to be in the presence of learning language again and learning reading. And like, I don't remember reading and writing, learning those things the first time. So I just thought, okay, here's a way to organize it. It has some relevance to the themes of the book. It's about reading and writing. Yeah, I made these long lists, and then I like wrote a bunch of pieces, and then I would just kind of collage them together. And retitle things, and then Rose Medal accepted it, but they said, oh, we'll probably want some revisions, and we'd like you to, I hadn't filled out the alphabet. I'm like, well, whatever, here's some letters. And they were like, well, how about you do the whole alphabet? And then also there were gaps in terms of what a reader might need to know. So then I probably wrote there's about 96, I think, pieces in the published version, and there are probably 8 or 10 that we cut out from the first version, some of them because they were just kind of weak, some because they had started as lineated poems, and they just didn't want to go into prose, and they just seemed weird, like they just didn't fit anymore. And then I wrote about, I don't know, maybe 40 or 50 probably wrote 50 new pieces, and then I sent a whole bunch of those to the editors, and then we sort of argued about what was in and what was out, and then we had to like rename things, and then there was another round where they still were like, well, this is great, but we need to end on, we had to bring back all these themes. So yeah, it got complicated, but it kept me off the streets, kept me busy. So
Questions from the audience?
Naomi Meredith here.
hi, Meredith.
Hi. And I was thinking, and when you spoke the first time round and talking about imagination, and I remember when I was young, I lived in the summertime with grandparents and in the woods. And I loved to go out at night and feel my way through there, or even close my eyes and just be there. And my imagination would become so rich at times like that. And wondering if what happens to imagination as you begin to lose your sightedness?
Is a great question. I think it's been both impaired and enhanced. There's ways in which when you don't get information, that you're used to getting. My brain still is like looking to see things. And so you imagine things. But I do also think that we need to have input and get fed in different ways. And so until I figured out non-visual ways of feeding my senses and, curiosity about the world, I think that was an impoverishment. But I think that as my memory has gotten shittier and shittier, my imagination has gotten way better. So that's the real thing I noticed. So thanks for that question. Yeah, birch trees are amazing, just gonna say, as a thing to go out and explore out in the woods. I think you have a question? I think there's.
Oh, I'm just here with the mic. Oh, being pretty newly blind, I have a question about how, and especially as it pertains to writing, like when you're, and I guess this would maybe hit on the imagination piece too, about like finding myself in two different worlds and how to navigate two different worlds. Because I'm starting to see, instead of seeing myself in one world, it's like, well, no wonder it's so hectic. It's because I'm in a blind world and I'm in a non-blind world. Like, because I have some vision, very little, but it's not functional. So I have to use all the resources from the world of the blind. And then I see a little bit so I could walk like in my house, which is helpful. But like, it just seems to be so exhausting doing both worlds. And did you feel like you had to pick, or do you feel like it comes together more?
That's a great question. And I would just name that for myself, well, a lot of the phases of my life have been exhausting. So I think the many-year phase of trying to pass as a sighted person were extremely exhausting. And I don't judge that former self for doing that, because the consequences of crossing over are real, right? And then I felt like, oh, I'm learning all these cool blindness tools, and I should fully inhabit blindness. And I was sort of embarrassed that I was like still draw birds and use a camera and do all these visual things. And I would also name that learning a whole new way of doing things is exhausting. Like vocational rehab was one of the coolest things I ever got to do. And, I would just face plant after a day of learning new things, especially with a 45, 50-year-old, 60-year-old brain. That brain is not, it works, but it's not as spongy as it was when I was 5. So just giving ourselves credit, like this is a really super full-time job to learn how to do new things. And it's not always going to be so exhausting. But now I feel like, yeah, why do I have to choose? Like, that's just bogus. Like, I get to be the being I am and not be, oh, I'm a blind person, and so I do all things all a certain way. And also, I do kind of like messing with people's expectations, so I enjoy that. But so whatever you want to do, you do.
Naomi, we have a question from the chat.
Okay.
In Body, you open the piece talking about how the body tries to compensate for what the eyes can no longer do. And in synesthesia, you talk about how you sometimes have difficulty distinguishing which senses you're using to interact with the world. I'm curious if this sort of sensory entanglement you describe in synesthesia is something that has developed for you as your sight has changed over time. And and how do those intertwined sensory experiences affect your writing?
That's a really cool question. And I don't actually know the answer, because I think both because the arc of my vision decay has been so long, like what my understanding of what our brains do is they're constantly just patching together the world in a way that we expect it to be. I remember reading, there's a BBC podcast about bodies called Made of Stronger Stuff. And I don't think there are new episodes, but in the episode about eyes, they talked about that basically all of us function the way I functioned for many years. So like I would go to the eye doctor and I would perform way better on the eye tests because I was kind of patching it together and because I was really motivated to still seem sighted, right? Because especially when you go to the doctors, they're like, so like, oh my God, blind person. Like you go into a doctor's office with a white cane and it's like, it could be like made of anthrax. Like they're just like fleeing, like it's just, you are a bad smell in a doctor's office when you have your cane. Like, so, sorry, I got a little distracted. Can you tell I love doctors? Not. But your brain, so anyway, I sort of realized, oh, my brain is filling in for what my eyes can't do. But actually, apparently that's what pretty much all humans do, is that, and so this factoid I heard in the Made of Stronger Stuff episode was that this is like 10% of what we call vision is input into the cells in our eyes, that then process it. And 90% of it is how our brain assembles it. And so I have no clue, I have no clue sometimes whether I'm actually feeling something or hearing it or seeing it. And I'm probably the worst person to chart like how that evolved over time. My spouse might, if you bribe him, tell you. He probably has some opinions, but I don't know if he'll. But it's interesting to me, like that it just. There's a piece in the book where when I got COVID, I lost my sense of smell, and I was just like way more klutzy, and like I just didn't realize that I was using. I'm not always aware that I'm smelling something, but yeah, I'll stop there because not everybody's into all the bodily functions the way I'm. So, ding, done. Yeah. Thanks for that question.
You write Brielle cell in a stream of consciousness. So alongside other cells like molecular, prison, can you talk about how, and you already kind of touched based on this, but can you kind of talk about how it felt to you? One of my favorite entries in the in Brielle is marriage. That entry, you don't get too emotional in Brielle, but in marriage, I really see your emotions shine through. You're talking about the divorce of your parents. And so I'm just wondering, how did writing this book feel for you? And just reflecting on, memories and childhood memories. And again, just writing chapters like marriage, that's just really emotionally taxing. And even error. Just how did that feel? And then also talking about the cells, the molecular and.
So I'm hearing this as, so the piece Cell was one of the first pieces I finished in the book. And then the piece Marriage was a much, bless you, more recent piece. So the cell piece has just all these different definitions of cell. And I just kind of wrote them and mashed them together. So so it starts with, I don't really know why a Braille cell is called a cell. And, then I kind of, there's a lot of places in the book where I get into the origins of words. And so I just, as a poet, just kind of wrote down all these things I learned about cells and how long a red blood cell lives. And then they just kind of seem to sit together. There was just some way in which by association they meant something together. And then to speak to, so Marriage is a piece about, my parents didn't actually divorce, but what I can't divorce is that my father was diagnosed with a form of dementia a few months before I got my diagnosis of this retinal condition that has destroyed some of my sight. And so that's what I can't tease apart, is that those two sort of trajectories of change we're always entangled, the same way in synesthesia, my senses are entangled. And so the feelings thing, like one of the things I thought was cool about writing an encyclopedia was that you didn't have to be emotional, right? It's like, oh, I don't have to do any feelings. And I feel a couple kinds of ways about that, because genuinely, people tell me I'm a pretty low asset, like I don't put my feelings right up top. And I grew up in a generation and a culture where it's like, yeah, none of your like my family didn't do feelings. So at first I didn't even know you were supposed to have these things. And then like when I did that therapy degree, I was like, what? Oh, okay. Is that what that weird feeling in my belly is? That's a feeling? Okay. But also, I think in a genuine way, people don't, I think sometimes when we write memoirs, we're expected as people who've maybe had some kind of trauma experience to share all about how we felt about it.
Mhm.
And it's our choice as writers whether we want to go there or not. So that's part of what I'm hoping to do with the book is like not be coy, like to be real about the things that suck or how I felt about things, but also not to necessarily that we have to all fit our lives into an expected like, oh wow, like as the guy said on the ledge, like wow, that must suck. Like sometimes it sucks, sometimes it's cool, you know. So anyway.
In future work, so you mentioned that Brielle almost became, it was a collection of essays, and then you kind of, started dibbling, dabbling, going down different rabbit holes. Can we expect a collection of essays from you in the future and where you can kind of, quote unquote, go there, right? And
Uh-huh. I'm not sure what I'm doing next. My next project was really about reclaiming my relationship with visual art. So I have this sort of obsessive thing where I have a camera that has a huge zoom lens. So I can see there's a little black dot and then I take a picture of it and then I blow it up on my computer and it turns out to be like, ooh, it's an eagle. And I used to be more of a visual artist. So I've been playing around with a drawing practice. And that is in some way that I can't necessarily articulate, also entangled with my relationship with nature. So that was, I have a really crappy draft of that. And so that's kind of what I thought I was going to do next when I got back to work after putting Braille Encyclopedia out into the world. But I do also feel like I have a bunch of essays that, like, I have kind of some unfinished business, like things that I just wrote a little something about in the Braille Encyclopedia. And I'm like, I might have some more opinions about that now or want to go deeper. So yeah, that's what I know today.
So we have about a couple more minutes, and so I'm going to take a question from the audience.
Naomi J here, and I'm wanting to go, in a sense, to the emotional ups and downs. I don't want to end on a low note, but having experienced retinal problems that were pretty serious and improving a bit, but I was a lost soul. I'd like to hear your ideas, your experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of years, I wasn't happy about it when it happened, but also I was 30, right? So it was, which was both good and bad, right? Like at 30, you have, I had more flexibility and like, oh, maybe I'd try a new approach. And I think about even now in my 60s, like it would be harder to start over. And yeah, we get to feel what we feel about it. Like I think it sort of refers back to my what I was saying before is that both I didn't want to write a book about my feelings, right? Like I wanted to be inclusive of that. Like I didn't want to hide my feelings about various things along the way. But also, that wasn't the only note for me. And that I'm not saying that's how it's going to be for other folks. I had the privilege of getting to learn that like there's this whole other world of ways of doing things. And I found that exciting, right? And the book is in some ways is about my excitement and like, oh, there's this whole world out there. But we all get to feel about it how we feel about it. And then the other thing is going back to the imagination and memory question was, I don't actually remember what I thought 30 or felt 30 years ago, right? Like it's just kind of a blur back there. So I wouldn't say I made it up, but it's as factual as I can make it. Let's say that about how, when I was writing about things that happened decades ago, yeah, I might think I felt a certain way, but I-
When you were 30 and starting to happen, you weren't journaling how you were feeling.
Well, okay, I was journaling, but I can't read those, so I don't have. I did actually find a couple journal entries, like it was 1993, so I did actually have a couple files in like WordPerfect or something. But no, I don't have access to that former self in the way that I would. So, which is maybe sad for my editors who wanted me to like go back there. But in a way, it's kind of freeing. I don't know.
We have
So-
time for one more question. I'm going to take it here from the chat. Has the change in your sight changed how you dream? For example, are your dreams more auditory?
I still have super visual dreams. Now, 90% of them take place in the apartment I grew up in. So maybe if I had more visual input over the last 30 years, I'd have more interesting dreams. But I think that's true. I think a lot of us, that's the, like we have that high school dream where we didn't take the math test. Like we all go back to these old spaces. So I'm still a pretty visual dreamer. Yeah. Interesting question. But I've talked to when I first started to lose my sight, I talked to other artists and writers who were losing their sight, and I heard all different kinds of answers. So I think that's brain by brain, maybe, or person by person. Cool question.
And I think that's a lovely note to end on. We're all still visual dreamers. I think that's beautiful. So thank you so much, Naomi, for coming out to Fireside Reading Series.
Yeah.
She will be hanging out with us, so still time for questions. I hope you all make it home safely, and thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks so much.